Hey everyone, welcome back. I want to start today's show with a word association question. I'm going to say a word, and I want you in your head to think about the first word that comes to your mind and what the first image is. You ready? Alcohol. What's the first word that came to your mind? What was the image? Now, if you said history, well, okay, my hat's off to you, but for a lot of you out there, I'm not, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say I'm not entirely confident that history was your answer. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, I mean, what the heck does alcohol have to do with history? There's a lot of things we interact with on a daily basis that probably are going to remind us a lot more about history than, say, that bottle of Coors Light in your hand. Maybe it's that building at the end of the road that's over 100 years old. Maybe it's that baseball that's on your desk that was signed by one of your favorite players who played decades ago. Maybe it's that book on your shelf that's talking about Abe Lincoln. I have a feeling those things you're probably going to correlate with history more than that bottle of Coors Light you're holding in your hand. I mean, come on. When you're looking at a beer, I don't think you're going to go, Russian Revolution. I don't think you're going to go, wow, this drink reminds me of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Wow, this shot of whiskey really reminds me of Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism. Because seriously, what the heck does alcohol have to do with any of that? Well, my friends, turns out it has a heck of a lot to do with all of those things that I just mentioned. Alcohol played a huge role in defining the world that we live in today. And now I want to tell you 10 short stories about how alcohol changed the course of world history. Bottoms up. I'm Andrew Baldwin, and this is the History Tens.
Okay, we're go.
We're go. Think high. We're go.
Altitude 1600.
Eagle looking great.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
That's what we did.
And the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy tornadoes. Undoubtedly Japanese.
Let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness.
Six, five, four,
With growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
one.
This is the History Tens.
All right, let's not waste any time. I want to take us back to 1620 and explore a new angle of one of the most familiar stories from our history books. I mean, I remember first hearing this story when I was in kindergarten, and odds are that's probably when you heard it too. But not this angle that we're going to be exploring specifically with alcohol. And that story, of course, I'm talking about is the Pilgrims and their journey on the Mayflower to what eventually would become America 150 years later. And yes, there's an angle to this story of all things that involves alcohol. You see, the colonists on the Mayflower, the reason that they stopped at Plymouth Rock rather than where the Royal Charter said they were going to be heading to, the Virginia colony, was because they were running short on key provisions with winter approaching. And perhaps the most important provision that they were low on was, of all things, beer. Now, of course, I don't think many of us would be associating pilgrims with beer. These, of course, are devout religious people who were escaping religious persecution over in England. These aren't wild, crazy Caribbean pirates who, of course, drink and loot and pillage all day. Again, very devout religious people, and yet beer was a huge cornerstone of their travel across the Atlantic on the Mayflower, and it was the reason that they had to stop at Plymouth Rock. So picture this. It's mid-November of 1620. The Pilgrims have sailed across the ocean with the intention of reaching Virginia. Now they've reached present-day Cape Cod. And the problem that they've had is that it took them a lot longer and the voyage was a lot rougher than they originally expected. They thought they were going to be reaching Virginia several weeks ahead of when they actually were at Cape Cod. So once they reached Cape Cod, they spent several days trying to sail to the south to Virginia where they were originally planning. But remember, this is the 17th century. They only have the power of sail and they don't have steam engines. And on top of that, it's November. Winter's approaching. Seas are getting rough. So after a few attempts to go south with all these things working against them in the rough winter seas, they can't do it. And now they have to return and go back to Cape Cod, and they have to drop anchor, which they do on November 11th. And they have to head ashore because they are out of supplies. And specifically, the main supply that they are out of is beer. And again, I keep coming back to beer. What is it about beer? Beer was the main drinking source for the Pilgrims on their ocean travels. You see, you didn't have Pilgrims drinking water on ships like you would expect. That would be any normal expectation for a drinking water source, right? The problem is, all of these ships that are going across the Atlantic Ocean, their water is not safe to use. It sits in barrels, it becomes stagnant, and it's filled with microorganisms. Drink it, you're going to become sick. But one thing that the Pilgrims have already figured out is they know that beer, you will not get sick if you drink it. And the reason for that is because the alcohol that's in the beer kills the microorganisms. The settlers knew this, and so instead of drinking water for hydration, they were always drinking beer. And we're not talking about a light amount of beer here. Every single day on this entire sea voyage across the Atlantic, every single pilgrim, every single person on this ship, so the Pilgrims, the captain, his crew, each person on that ship was specifically rationed 1 gallon of beer a day. 1 gallon of beer a day per person was the expected amount to drink. And again, this is not light beer these folks are drinking. They're drinking beer that's about 6%. 6% beer, which is probably about the equivalent of a Lagunitas IPA. And to give you an idea, Coors Light is 4.2%. Yeah, 4.2% is the alcohol percentage. So every day, think about drinking about a gallon of 6% beer, and that's what you're drinking to stay hydrated, folks. So then you have to bring obviously a huge amount of beer with you on these trips across the Atlantic. And again, by the time the settlers reached Cape Cod and were unable to go south to Virginia, they now didn't have enough beer. So anchor was dropped at Cape Cod, and the Pilgrims set off to land on Plymouth Rock. And by choosing to land at Plymouth Rock, because they were low on beer, and to be fair, other supplies, they became the first permanent European settlers in New England.
9.
I'm going to stick with an ocean theme for this next one. We're going to go back to a time period between 1500 and 1800. In this 300-year period, there were an estimated 2 million sailors, 2 million sailors around the world who died of a disease, a terrible disease that came from a vitamin C deficiency. A disease that is so horrible, it's chronicled this way specifically from a sailor's diary in a 1535 voyage to Newfoundland. The chronicle says, quote, "In the month of December, an unknown sickness began to spread itself amongst us after the strangest sort that ever was either heard or seen, insomuch as some did lose all their strength and could not stand on their feet. Then their legs swell, their sinews shrink as black as coal. Others also had their skins spotted with spots of blood, a purple color. Then did it become stinking. Their gums so rotten that all the flesh did fall off. Even to the roots of the teeth, which did almost fall out with such infection, did the sickness spread itself in our 3 ships, that about the middle of February, of 110 persons that we were, there were not 10 whole, so that one could not help the other. A most horrible and pitiful case." End quote. Of course, the disease I'm talking about is scurvy. Scurvy was the absolute scourge of navies around the world for this 300-year period between 1500 and 1800. Because again, it forms from a vitamin C deficiency. And as you probably know from your health classes, vitamin C is the main vitamin that we find mostly in fruits. And it devastated navies around the world during this time period because soldiers weren't getting vitamin C because they didn't have the food to eat that contained vitamin C. It wasn't uncommon for more than 50% of a ship's crew to perish from scurvy in any typical major voyage. So often, more sailors would die from scurvy than from storms, wrecks, battle, and all other diseases combined. In order for navies to compete against other navies around the world, it essentially became a battle of attrition. If you can just get to the battlefield against an opposing navy with more men than the other side because your side was able to fight off scurvy better, you have a much greater chance of winning. And it's here that the British Navy came along and found a possible solution to scurvy. And as a result of finding a possible solution, it resulted in less sick crews, less deaths, and much better ability to conquer their enemies, thus propelling Britain to become the #1 navy by far in the world by the beginning of the 19th century. And the way they defeated scurvy was with alcohol. What happened was that a man named James Lind, who became known as the father of naval medicine, via an experiment in 1747 on board a naval ship who had, of course, many soldiers dealing with scurvy. And what he found was that by giving citrus fruits to sailors with scurvy helped to relieve the symptoms. Now, there was a lot of debate about whether it was citrus fruits or if it was other controlling factors that James Lind was using, but this information slowly began to pass through the Navy, and then it ultimately came to a head in 1794, when there was a naval ship called the Suffolk that left on a 23-week nonstop voyage to India. And what happened was several senior officials, including one man named Rear Admiral Alan Gardner, specifically issued an order of lemon juice to be used by all of the sailors on the ship during the trip. Specifically, there was a daily ration of 2/3 of an ounce of lemon juice that would be mixed into an alcoholic drink called grog. Now, grog was a drink that was mixed with 3 things: water, of course, those 2/3 of an ounce of lemon juice, and of course, rum. And by putting this much lemon juice into the grog, sailors were getting about a 10 milligram daily dose of vitamin C. And guess what happened? On this entire 23-week journey to India, there was not a single serious outbreak of scurvy. This astonishing event quickly spread through the British Navy, and it led to a widespread demand within the Navy for more lemon juice to be placed into grog. Soon it was clear that the lemon juice was going to be helping with reducing illnesses like scurvy. And again, this is an illness that had been plaguing the navies of the world at that time and was keeping a huge percentage of ship crews out of commission. By Britain putting lemon juice in grog, an alcoholic drink, and consuming it and having enough vitamin C in their intake to not get scurvy, Britain now had a huge advantage over all of its adversaries in terms of keeping its crews healthy. Who do you think's going to win in a naval encounter between 2 ships of roughly the same size and roughly the same crews, but half the crew of one of those ships is suffering from scurvy, while on the other ship, everyone is healthy? And this is why in the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain truly became the dominant naval power of the world for a very long time.
8.
Not to make this a political podcast, but I'm sure a lot of us out there are pretty sick of the constant back and forth 2-party battle that we have going on in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, it turns out that alcohol actually has played a role in why we're dealing with a 2-party system right now in America. Specifically, there was one type of alcohol that helped create this: whiskey. Whiskey helped to create political parties in the United States, and why we, today, are having the joy of constantly dealing with back and forth battling between Republicans and Democrats. And again, I'm not taking a side in this Republican versus Democrat debate. I'm just sitting back and letting you know that one of the reasons we have these 2 specific parties going toe-to-toe today is because of alcohol. And again, specifically, whiskey. And even more specifically, I'm talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, what on earth was the Whiskey Rebellion? Long story short, the Whiskey Rebellion was a 3-year event in the brand new United States. It happened from 1791 from 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion was a tax protest that took place under President George Washington. So let's go back to 1791. It's 1791. America is fresh off of winning its independence from England in the Revolution. But there's one huge problem facing the new American government, and it's probably something you can realistically expect to be dealing with a few years after a major war. The US government was in debt. The government was essentially drowning in all the debt that had been incurred as a result of fighting and winning the American Revolution. So, let's think about it. If you're a big government and you're drowning in debt, what are you probably going to have to do to generate revenue as a result of that debt? you're probably going to have to create or raise taxes. And in this case, the government, led by President Washington, passed a whiskey tax. Now, the term the whiskey tax, I want to say, is a little misleading because it actually wasn't a tax on just whiskey. It was actually a tax on all distilled spirits in America. But the reason why it's called the whiskey tax was because whiskey just happened to be the most consumed spirit in America at the time, and thus it got the name the whiskey tax. Now, there's a problem with the government doing this. And think about this if you're a citizen of the new United States. Wasn't one of the reasons that you actually went to war with Britain and threw off that yoke and actually became your own independent nation was because you were getting really tired of this concept of taxation without representation? Well, this was the way it was seen by a lot of new citizens, and particularly farmers in Western Pennsylvania, because these were the people who were going to be affected the most by this whiskey tax. Under this new law, you had larger producers, primarily based in the eastern part of the country, who would be paying the tax at a rate of about 6 cents per gallon. And that's per gallon of total whiskey that was produced by the distiller. And the more they were able to produce, the larger their tax breaks were. The problem was these smaller producers who were out in the western frontier, because again, remember, Western Pennsylvania at this time really is the frontier. These guys were stuck paying 9 cents per gallon in taxes. And the other problem was these farmers out in the West had to pay their taxes in cash. And a lot of people out in the western frontier at the country at the time didn't have cash. They would actually be using whiskey as a form of exchanging. So with these issues of being able to be less competitive against Eastern distillers, and also having to deal with the problem of not having much cash available to pay these taxes, and the thought of this is taxation without representation. This is the very thing that we claim to be fighting against Britain for. Because of all these issues these farmers had, these farmers in Western Pennsylvania rebelled, and they rebelled in force. The Whiskey Rebellion itself over the 3-year period is something that deserves a podcast in and of itself, but ultimately the rebellion was crushed in 1794 after about 3 years of struggle between almost 600 of these Western Pennsylvania rebels and about 13,000 militia that were called in from multiple states. Now, there wasn't a huge death toll. It wasn't a huge war event. It resulted in about 4 deaths and about 170 captured prisoners, which, again, might seem anticlimactic. But you also have to consider the lasting legacies of this. There were really 2. The first was that it proved that this new federal government of the United States actually had the ability to suppress violent resistance to its laws and actually protect the Constitution that had been written. And of course, the second part of this is the part that I mentioned earlier. The Whiskey Rebellion was a critical moment in the actual fracturing and eventual formation of differing political parties. You see, this whiskey tax caused a division in ideologies between members of government and ultimately the American people themselves. The whiskey tax was opposed from the start by one specific political party that was just starting to form in the 1790s. And that party, called, confusingly for those of us today who live in the Democrat versus Republican era, this single party was called the Democratic Republican Party. And this party had been founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And their main rival, the other party that was slowly starting to establish itself around this time period, was the Federalist Party, which was headed by George Washington. And up until this time period, the Federalist Party was really in complete control of everything. But this was when you started to see the other party, the Democratic Republican Party, actually starting to make a presence. Eventually, just 10 years later, 10 years after the whiskey tax went into effect in 1801, Jefferson's and Madison's Democratic Republican Party came to power and repealed the whiskey tax. And from that point, we have solidified political parties in the American political system going forward. Now, it's an endless, amazing story that weaves in around with the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist parties and how they dissolved into other parties like the Whig Party and ultimately the Democratic and Republican parties of today. But again, to round this all up, put a nice little bow on it, one of the key reasons that we have political parties in America today, and we now have this endless back and forth Democrat versus Republican struggle, is because of a tax that was placed on alcohol. Thanks, whiskey tax.
7,
Alexander the Great, one of the most important names in all of history. I'm talking, of course, about the famous king of Macedonia who lived from 356 to 323 BC. Alexander was maybe the greatest military conqueror in history. He never lost a battle, and he built an empire that was over 3 million square miles, which was the largest the world had ever known up until that time. And on top of that, as part of his conquest, there were several other side effects that changed the world at that time. And the main one I'm talking about is the blending of Eastern and Western cultures. And this happened in three ways. Greek influence culture, also known as Hellenism, spread to most of the known world. And the passage of his armies through the mountainous regions of modern-day Afghanistan and Tibet led to the expansion of trade routes between Europe and Asia. And the opening of these routes not only increased trade, but also allowed cultural and religious exchanges between East and West. Now, for all these good things that Alexander did, well, as good as you can possibly call the invading armies conquering and slaughtering tons of people, but let's leave that for another day. Considering all these good things he did, Alexander was also quite famously a huge drunk. And there's lots of debate, actually, as to whether or not alcoholism is what ultimately took his life at age 32. But not only is there the big picture of Alexander possibly dying from alcoholism, there were a lot of crazy little events that happened while he was drunk. I don't want to tell you one quick and, in some ways, so ridiculous it's almost funny story about his drinking. We're going to go back to 328 BC. Alexander, he's throwing a big party in a city called Samarkand, which is in present-day Uzbekistan. And he's throwing this big party just after getting a new piece of land in the Middle East called Bactria. And to be more specific, Alexander is going to be giving command of this land to an officer in his army. And this man also happens to be a dear friend of Alexander. This man actually saved Alexander's life in battle 6 years earlier. The man's name is Clitus, although in the history books his official name is Clitus the Black. So anyway, during this party, as you can expect, there's a lot of food and drink going around. And of course, most of the people there eventually, including Alexander, wind up pretty damn drunk. Now, here's where the sources start to get a little conflicted on what actually happened, but here's one of the main accounts. Alexander decided that there was going to be a new organization within the army. And as a result of this organization, Alexander ordered that Clitus needs to take a large group of these Greek mercenaries are within the army. Not sure of the exact number, but it's somewhere around 16,000. And Clitus needs to head north with these troops to fight the tribes that are on the steppes of Central Asia. And let's remember this. Central Asia at this time is considered essentially the ends of the earth. It's the middle of absolute nowhere. And Clitus is being commanded to take his troops and go fight out there. Now, naturally, Clitus is angered by this. By doing this, he's going to the ends of the earth, and he's going also far away from Alexander. And if you're far away from Alexander, you're not exactly going to be getting a lot of press. You're not going to be really famous because you're nowhere near Alexander and you're fighting in an area where it takes forever for news to travel from. So, being angry about this and also being a little emboldened because of the fact that he too was drunk, Clitus, shall we say, disagreed with Alexander's decision here. And he let Alexander know about it in pretty choice words. And from there, things began to unravel pretty quickly. Alexander responded by drunkenly bragging about he had accomplished so much more than his father, Philip II, and so he's right to make this decision. And Philip II, you have to remember, he was the one who essentially started the conquest that Alexander had picked up and was finishing. And so there's a lot of debate about what Philip II would have accomplished had he not been assassinated, leaving Alexander to come to the throne of Macedonia. But again, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here. The point is that Alexander claimed he was achieving far more than his father could have ever possibly dared to achieve. Well, Clitus responded to that with further trash talk, saying that not only was Alexander just sort of resting on his father's laurels and only achieving great things because of the foundation his father laid down, Clitus also said that Alexander was not the legitimate king of Macedonia at all. And if you're drunk and more susceptible to emotional outbursts because of being drunk, you can probably assume Alexander didn't take that very well. So things got worse from there between these two drunken friends, and at this point it becomes almost like a drunken clown show. Alexander calls for his guards, but the guards don't want to get involved. Alexander then throws an apple at Clytus's head, then asks to be brought a weapon. But the people around Alexander are moving all the weapons away from Alexander because they can see where this is going. Then a group of guards step in and they start to restrain Alexander, and then another group rushes in and pulls Clytus out of the room. Alexander, while being restrained, then asks for the entire army to be summoned. But again, the guards don't respond to this request. And then finally, Clytus, in possibly the worst decision he ever made, decided to go back into the room to hurl some more insults at Alexander. And then Alexander breaks free from the people restraining him, grabs a javelin, and throws it right into the heart of his dear friend Clytus, killing him on the spot. By doing this, by killing his friend Clytus due to a drunken fight, Alexander had accidentally killed one of his major generals. And again, let me remind you, the man who had saved his life in battle 6 years earlier. Alexander, once he'd sobered up, grieved afterwards for days over the death of his friends. So think about this. If Alexander had managed to keep his drinking under control and lived a longer life, and maybe not killed a friend or two along the way due to a drunken rage, there's no telling what may have happened. Remember, at the time of his death, Alexander was planning on expanding his empire southward into Arabia. At the time of his death, he was actually in the midst of returning to Macedonia from India in order to consolidate his empire further before starting to head towards Arabia. If he had lived to do this and conducted other campaigns, rather than possibly dying of alcoholism, it's possible the conditions to create the Roman Empire may never have existed, and India and the Middle East would have gone very different ways too. And the consequence of that means Christianity and Islam may never have come to exist.
6.
Alcohol played a role in the death of a famous American president. Quick little background. Many of us might assume that there's always been a very detailed guarding of the President of the United States, that we've always had the Secret Service watching our president's back. But that's not entirely true. The Secret Service didn't always exist. You didn't have George Washington or any of the presidents before 1902 being escorted around by men in dark suits. Now that changed in 1902, when the Secret Service took over the full-time responsibility of protecting the president. And a fun little bonus fact for you here. The Secret Service was originally created in 1865, and it was for the purpose of stopping the use of counterfeit money. And fun additional bonus fact, the Secret Service was actually signed into existence in 1865, the night before the president at that time, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. So up until 1902, protecting a U.S. president could be quite lax. I mean, in some cases, it wasn't even existent. And in 1865, a lackadaisical bodyguard and alcohol combined to play a role in the assassination of Abe Lincoln. It's April. It's 1865. The Civil War is coming to an end, and there's hope for peace and rebuilding this nation after years of bloodshed. And Abraham Lincoln, the president, decides to catch a play at Ford's Theater. Now, pretty much all Americans know what happens next. John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the room and shoots Abe in the back of the head behind his left ear. But what many Americans don't know about this famous story is that John Frederick Parker, who was the name of Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard that evening, wasn't even present at the time of the assassination. Now, this wasn't too unusual. It wasn't uncommon for presidents to only have one bodyguard back then for the reasons we just mentioned. And the other thing about Lincoln was he was particularly unconcerned about his personal safety. He would often go to plays or he'd go to church without any guards. He was never really a fan of having military escorts either. And get this, there were several times in his presidency where he would walk between the White House and the War Department a distance of about a quarter of a mile at night alone. Could you imagine a president doing that now? Walking a quarter mile between the White House and the War Department at night by himself? It's just crazy to think about it. So anyway, this was one of those nights where Lincoln actually had a bodyguard assigned to him. And again, the man's name was John Frederick Parker. Parker, though, that night, even by the standards of the time, was unusually lax in his duties of protecting the president. Now, for starters, when the evening began, he was seated originally outside the president's box, in the passageway next to the door. This is probably what you would expect of him, right? nobody could physically get to the president without going through this passageway. And this is the same passageway that John Wilkes Booth ultimately passed through on his way to shooting Lincoln. But Parker was sitting there, and he was frustrated while in the seat, because from where he was sitting, he couldn't see the stage. He wanted to watch the play. So after Lincoln and his guests settled in, Parker got up, left the seat and the president unprotected, and went down into the gallery to watch the show. And then it only got worse from there, and this is where alcohol gets involved. You see, at intermission, the footman and the coachman of Lincoln's carriage came up to Parker and said, "Hey, let's get a beer." So Parker kindly accepts the offer, and both him and the coachman leave the theater and go right next door to the Star Saloon. The man who is supposed to be bodyguarding the President of the United States is now not even in the same building as the President. He's next door at the Star Saloon getting drinks. Now, no one knows for sure where Parker actually was during the assassination, but it's still believed to be very possible that he was still sitting at the Star Saloon sipping drinks when John Wilkes Booth fired that Derringer into Abe's head. And in another interesting twist of fate, John Wilkes Booth had actually been in the same Star Saloon right before he went into the theater to shoot Lincoln. While we don't know for sure, it's possible that Parker and Booth were in the Star Saloon together before Booth headed over to Ford's Theater. Now, a fellow presidential bodyguard afterwards, William H. Crook, had the following to say about Parker and his decision to go drinking. Quote, "Had he done his duty, I believe President Lincoln would not have been murdered by Booth." End quote. Crook continued in his memoir, quote, "Parker knew that he had failed in duty. He looked like a convicted criminal the next day." End quote. So for Parker, he was charged with failing to protect the president. But for various reasons, the complaint was dismissed about a month later. Nevertheless, Mrs. Lincoln always blamed Parker for failing to protect her husband on that fateful night and for choosing to go have some drinks instead.
5,
Much of history consists of alliances and treaties, where it can be as small as tribes or it can be as large as whole nations or whole conglomerates of nations, basically saying, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But I want to talk about one of the oldest alliances of recorded history, and it's an alliance that's steeped in blood and alcohol. The alliance I'm talking about specifically is called the Old Alliance. Now, not old like old as a person, I mean old as in like Auld Lang Syne, the Scottish words, Auld Lang Syne. The Old Alliance was an alliance made in 1295 between two countries specifically, Scotland, as you would expect, and France. And the reason this old alliance between Scotland and France was created was for the purpose of helping to deal with the numerous invasions from their common enemy, England. This alliance lasted for about 265 years before it ultimately ended with the Treaty of Edinburgh in 1560. Now, the treaty worked just like NATO does today, but now it was only between two nations. Now, remember, the NATO agreement basically says if any country in the agreement is attacked by a foreign power, all the other nations in that agreement will immediately declare war on the hostile foreign power. The same situation applied here. If either Scotland or France was attacked by England, the other country promised as part of the Old Alliance that they would attack England. But it was even more than that, and this is where alcohol comes into play. Wine, specifically, played a huge role in the creating of the negotiating process for this Old Alliance. And what France promised as their end of the bargain, because they're probably known a little more for their wine than the Scots, the French gave primary access to Scottish merchants to the best wines in the Bordeaux region of France, including Bordeaux Claret, one of the most famous and, in my personal opinion, best tasting wines in the world. It was actually quoted specifically by Scottish writer Billy Kay, quote, "Claret definitely has a strong claim to be Scotland's national drink other than whiskey. The red wine of Bordeaux Claret had such a strong claim to be Scotland's national drink over the centuries that it was called the bloodstream of the Old Alliance." End quote. So let's talk about some examples of this Old Alliance at work, because it wasn't one of those alliances that just existed on paper. This alliance, which included that backing of Bordeaux Claret, actually was put into place several times. One of the main examples, 1513, the Battle of Flodden. There was an English campaign taking place against France at the time, And in response, King James of Scotland invaded England. Now, unfortunately for the Scots, it was one of their worst defeats in their entire history, but that's another thing. The bottom line was they honored this old alliance. And again, that's just one example. The alliance also came into play during the Wars of Scottish Independence, and it came into play during the 100 Years' War, where the Scots played roles in the Battle of Agincourt and also helped a lady named Joan of Arc in Orleans. Now, the exact effects of this alliance are debatable in terms of the large picture, but there's a lot of belief among historians that it essentially did two things. One, it helped slow down English expansion on the world stage dramatically until the colonial era, because England now had to deal with this dual threat of Scotland and France. And the second thing it did was that for the first time in history, it gave Scotland a major international ally, which propelled the Scots further forward on the world stage.
4.
Alcohol played a key role in the colonial expansion of America. But unfortunately, it was a way where alcohol was used as a crutch and taking advantage of those who were already there. I'm talking about the effect it had on Native Americans. Now, folks, I want to step back for 1 second because, well, to be honest, I'm a little hesitant to go forward on this one because there's a recency effect to this. There are descendants alive today and very strong advocates who are still bearing the scars of what I'm about to talk about. And it is certainly not my intention to offend, so I just want to be very clear about that. I understand the pain that still exists from what I'm about to talk about, and I acknowledge that. I want to clarify, I don't want to take sides in this debate. I'm just a fan of history. I like to sit and eat popcorn on the sidelines while reading multiple accounts of this stuff. So again, bear with me, just want to get that out of the way at the beginning. So, in reading history sources, there's an awful lot of talk about how Native American peoples had a weakness with alcohol. And there are some honest, interesting statistics to back this up as well. According to the American Journal of Public Health, among contemporary Native Americans and Alaskan Natives, about 11.7% of all deaths are alcohol related. And to give you an idea by comparison, about 5.9% of global deaths, about half of that, is attributable to alcohol consumption. So back to American expansionism, many sources say that alcohol played a key role in being able to expand through Native American territory. The stories may be horrible and sad, but they're there. I want to start by talking about how many Native Americans may have been more susceptible to the effects of alcohol than Europeans. Now, the first problem's in the introduction. There's a number of early accounts that report many Native Americans had no tradition of making alcoholic beverages prior to the arrival of Europeans, and so thus were naive to the effects of alcohol. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this. For example, there were some Native Americans in the Southwest who brewed alcoholic beverages, but it was almost exclusively beer, and certainly nothing with distilled spirits. And also, for the few tribes that made different types of alcohol, it was only really used in ritual settings, and there certainly was enough of it to be consumed on a daily recreational basis. So, you only have beer, no distilled spirits, and you only have alcohol being consumed in ritual settings, and it's not being consumed on a daily basis. And this is a practice that is maintained for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's a completely different cultural experience than how we're seeing with Europeans. So now, suddenly you have Europeans showing up who have huge quantities of alcohol that are consumed on a regular basis. And on top of that, they're making huge amounts of it available as well for themselves and the Native Americans. And Europeans, on top of all of this, have the advantage that they have been culturally raised around alcohol. To these Native American tribes, it's essentially a shock experience where they have very little time to adapt and actually develop social, legal, and moral guidelines to regulate alcohol use. And to be fair to the Native Americans, there were problems right from the start with alcohol consumption. There are many accounts talking about how Native Americans initially responded to alcohol and their sudden ability to drink it a lot more with distaste, suspicion, and even detesting things like drunkenness. Many accounts talk about how Native Americans would only drink during social contact or actually doing trading with the Europeans. But this could only last for so long when there's this much of an exposure to alcohol. And by around the early 1700s, things began to break down for them. And Europeans on the other side of the coin were beginning to understand this and start to take advantage of the Native Americans' lack of experience and the moral guidelines that go with alcohol. Because again, European society's been dealing with this for endless generations. And so they know how to deal with it, and they know that the Native Americans do not. This is thousands of years of cultural understanding about alcohol being thrown into the faces of Native Americans within a couple years. And many historians don't think any of us could have handled it any better than them. As quoted by historian Fred Bouvet, quote, "Early traders built a large demand for alcohol by using it as a means to trade, exchanging it for highly sought-after animal skins and other materials and resources. Traders also discovered that giving free alcohol to Native Americans during trading sessions gave them a distinct advantage during negotiations." End quote. So now, on top of the Native Americans being taken advantage of in trade situations, you now have Native Americans, again, not having any real cultural experience with dealing with alcohol and drunkenness, now having several side effects coming into play. Men in the tribes are becoming less reliable hunters. Village economies are becoming destabilized and poverty is increasing. And now, on top of all of that, they're now more susceptible to attack by colonists. To drive this point home, there was a council meeting in Pennsylvania in May 1704 where there was a complaint submitted by a chief of the Conestoga Indians where he said, quote, "Great quantities of rum continually brought to their town, insomuch as they are ruined by it, having nothing left but have laid out all, even their clothes, for rum, and may now, when threatened with war, be surprised by their enemies when beside themselves with drink, and so be utterly destroyed." End quote. What this chief is saying is that the colonists would give them alcohol, the Native Americans would get drunk, and then be attacked and killed when they were in a vulnerable state. There are many stories across American history that repeat this same theme over and over again. And the Native Americans understood they were being taken advantage of this way. But in many ways, they seemed powerless to stop it. Again, I'm going to read another quote because there's so many quotes attributable to these stories. This quote comes from a Shawnee chief in Ohio of 1773 who believed that alcohol was being introduced intentionally to undermine the culture of Native Americans. Quote, "As the white people understand the weakness and incapacity of the Indians, they have a certain power over us, while pretending that with all their deception, they mean well by the Indians. They come and bring rum into our towns, offer it to the Indians, and say, 'Drink.' This they will do until they become quite beside themselves and act as though they were out of their heads. Then the white people stand and point at them with their fingers, laugh at them, and say, 'See what great fools the Sha'anos are.' But who makes them so foolish? Who is at fault?" End quote. The stories go on and on and on. Sitting here in the 21st century, it's easy to wonder how many times in Native American history were they taken advantage of like this, and how often did it displace and disrupt their society further. We can't deny reading stories like this that alcohol has truly had a terrible effect on Native American peoples. The true cost may never be known.
3,
I want to swing across the Atlantic Ocean for this one back into Europe. Because in Europe, alcohol played a role in the rise of communism. Let's go back to the early 20th century, to specifically the Russo-Japanese War, which was fought fittingly between Russia and Japan. This was a war that was fought between 1904 and 1905, in which Japan, surprisingly, was the victor. Now, during this war, one of the things that really hurt the Russian infantry was that there were many incidents of Russian troops being unable to fight or even mobilize because they were too drunk. Now, there was a reason for Russian troops often being drunk, and why there seems to be a stereotype in Hollywood and other places where Russian soldiers are often seen as wasted. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, before the Russo-Japanese War was really going hot, alcohol was actually considered to be the most effective means of fighting disease and epidemics, as well as hunger and cold. And each soldier in the Russian army specifically would get a ration of 2 cups of wine or vodka a day, one in the morning and another in the evening. And on top of that, his ration would include a daily allowance of 3 liters of beer. And on top of that, for outstanding service, a soldier could earn an additional portion of booze. So if you have all this alcohol available to you and you're a soldier fighting in absolutely miserable conditions in the Russo-Japanese War, I don't think it's much of a stretch to think you would be getting drunk too. Now, with the turn of the 20th century and the understanding that there were better sources of medicine than just drinking a lot, the Russian Empire decided to step in and take steps to curb drinking. But the Russian Tsar may have gone a little bit too far. You see, in 1914, another war broke out. A bigger war. A war we've probably all heard of. World War I. And with the start of World War I, the Russian Empire specifically banned alcohol, which in Russia appropriately was mostly vodka. And the reason this was done was that soldiers wouldn't be drunk and thus would be able to fight more effectively. But there was a little bit of a problem with the Russian Empire doing this. You see, the taxes on vodka provided as much as half of government income. And with the vodka banned, boom, that source of income's gone. Right at a time in history when the governments of Europe were going to need all the money they could get to fight World War I. So you're probably thinking, well, why the heck would they do that? Why the heck would they ban alcohol? Well, you see, many people predicted that World War I was going to be this short, romantic affair. And so they probably wouldn't even need that extra tax revenue because the war would be over within a couple months. And unfortunately, it instead turned into one of the most bloody and horrible affairs in human history, where every source of revenue was going to be needed in order to keep raising the capital to fight the war effort. So with half of your revenue to fight this war undercut immediately, it wasn't long before Russia was feeling the pinch. And in addition to all of this, with alcohol being banned, it meant countryside peasants no longer needed to sell surplus grain for vodka. If nobody's drinking alcohol, then what's the point? So because of them no longer selling surplus grain, food shortages began to form in Russian cities. So now you have all these factors building up that are working against the Russian government. You have hyperinflation from the lack of government income. You have angry and hungry citizens beginning to riot. And then you have Russian soldiers who are being just slaughtered in the trenches and don't have anything to pick up their spirits, such as, say, alcohol might. They begin to revolt. All of these factors combine to play roles in the ultimate fall of Russia to communism in 1917. While alcohol almost certainly wasn't the main reason for this, you can tell by this story that it certainly played a role. And without communism in the 20th century, the world is a very different place today.
2.
The slave trade was fueled in part by alcohol, specifically rum. Now, before I go into some detail on this, I want to give a quick reminder of how rum is made because it's important in understanding the whole picture. The key element of rum in colonial times is molasses. Molasses is made from either sugarcane or sugar beet juice being boiled down to a syrup. The sugar crystals are then removed from the syrup, and that remaining dark liquid is molasses, right? This molasses is then fermented with yeast and water so that it's broken down into alcohol. And from there, it's distilled, meaning alternated between heating and cooling, in copper pot stills so that the liquid can be purified into the high alcohol content drink that is rum. And then finally, this distilled product is aged in barrels until it's finally ready for consumption, with the type of barrel and the length of aging vary between one distiller and another. Now, the key part of all of this is the first step to what I'm talking about, where the sugar is extracted from the cane juice and the resulting product is molasses. Now, molasses was originally considered nothing more than a waste product of sugar production. But eventually it was discovered that rum could be made from molasses. And rum instantly became a staple of the colonies of New England. And as a result of all of this, what we now call the triangular trade was created. And the triangular trade was a system of trade involving three products: rum, sugar, and slaves. And it involved three locations: New England, the Caribbean, and Africa. Slaves would be taken from Africa, and they would be shipped to grow sugar on the Caribbean plantations. The molasses from the plantations would then be sent to New England, where it was made to rum. And then finally, it was shipped to Africa, who responded by sending more slaves, thus creating the triangular trade. A male slave from Africa was actually paid for in rum, typically costing about 150 gallons a slave, which is horrible enough when you consider that they're valuing human life based on gallons of rum. And what's even more horrifying is even 150 gallons of rum isn't that much when you consider the average New England colonist drank the equivalent of about 8 shots of rum a day. I guess that makes sense then, since it was no big deal for the people on the Mayflower to be drinking a gallon of 6% beer every single day.
1.
And finally, for this last part, I want to talk real quick about how alcohol may have been the main reason for perhaps the greatest invention in all of human history: farming and agriculture. Farming, remember, fundamentally changed the course of human history. It's what allowed people to switch from the small and mobile hunter-gatherer tribes to being able to actually settle in one area, which led to the creation of villages, towns, cities, nations, and ultimately the modern world as we know it today. Now, the start of farming is believed to have taken place around the end of the Stone Age, which is about 7,000 BC in China and around 5,000 BC in Iran. And it consisted of people trying to domesticate and grow wild grains. Now, what historians are still debating about is what exactly motivated people to start trying to domesticate and grow wild grains in the first place. And for a long time, the main belief for this was simple. The reason that we were growing wild grains was so that we can make bread, a high-calorie and abundant food source, right? But it's interesting, in the 1950s, this idea started to change among historians. And now it's believed that Stone Age farmers were actually trying to make something else from wild grains. Probably know where I'm going with this. They were trying to make beer. And some evidence that caused this shift in thinking were discoveries such as noticing the first maize, or corn, that was used by ancient Mexicans was better suited for beer than flour. And around this time period, there was also a discovery of early Chinese pottery that contained rice beer. And what had that beer been fermented from? Saliva. Now, why would farmers do this? Why would they focus on beer over bread? It's for 3 reasons. Number 1, it makes you feel good and drunk, of course. And number 2, it has all the same nutrients as bread while tasting better. And of course, the third one, to kind of round out to that first point I made about the Mayflower, it's more sterile than water. And with that, our History 10s list, talking about 10 times alcohol changed world history, comes to a close.
0.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this second episode of the History 10s. Make sure that you subscribe and share this podcast if you enjoyed it. And if you can, please make sure to leave us a review on iTunes and Google Play so we can make sure this show is the very best and the most entertaining that it can be. For more information, check out our website at www.history10s.com. And make sure to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And this week, we're also launching Instagram and TikTok pages. We're going to provide links to all of these in our show notes. If you like the show, and if you felt the show was worth a buck, please feel free to become a subscriber on our Patreon page, or by going to www.history10s.com, where you can donate to our PayPal. It helps keeps the lights on and helps keeps this show rolling. Again, don't forget to check out our website at www.history10s.com for more information, including subscribing to our email list, updates on the show, our show notes and sources, and of course links to our Patreon and PayPal pages. On next week's show, we're going to be talking about 10 times weather events changed world history. Till next time, I'm Andrew Baldwin with the History 10s. Today's show was sponsored by Gaia GPS. Navigate, track, and explore with Gaia GPS, the gold standard of topographic maps and offline navigation tools. Please go to GaiaGPS.com/history10s. That's Gaia, Gaia, GPS.com/history10s, and get 20% off on a 1-year membership or up to 50% off on a 5-year membership. Navigate, track, and explore with Gaia GPS, the gold standard of topographic maps and offline navigation tools.